Before we delve into the topic of infrastructure messaging, I want to briefly introduce the Water Hub. We are a program of Climate Nexus and basically act like a nonprofit PR firm for the water movement. We have foundation support to provide a whole bunch of different services to groups working on the ground, including on implementing the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act's water provisions. And that can look like media and polling research, which we will share some of today. These sorts of trainings help with both getting press and also thinking through social media strategy, and then hands-on writing, design, pitching, media list development, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And for this hour, we are going to start with polling, basically sharing a little bit about how we at the Water Hub think about and use polling to inform our communications. And then we will dig into lessons from our most recent national voter poll. We fielded a national poll in August 2023, asked a bunch of questions about infrastructure as well as general water worries and how best to frame equity. And then we'll talk about how we translate that into messaging around infrastructure, and we'll have hopefully ample time at the end for Q&A. I want to kick off with a story. So when I started working at the Water Hub in 2019, one of the very first things I did was attend the U.S. Water Alliance One Water Summit in Austin, Texas. And I'd been working on water for probably 5 years at another nonprofit communication shop called Resource Media. And so I had quite a good grounding in the issue generally. But there was this really moving moment at the summit. I think it was like a lunch talk in which a community leader from Flint, Michigan, shared a story. And he led with talking about one of his first memories from childhood, being in the bath with his brother. And he remembered they had these superhero figurines and they were always clashing them and they were splashing water, and his parents would, chide them, but lovingly. And at the time I had a near newborn myself pictured here at GN, and bath time was also a super special family time for us. And this leader was talking about how a whole generation of families in Flint can't trust their tap water. And while lead is not absorbed through the skin, there was this feeling of, mistrust where you couldn't put kids in the bath. First of all, they drink the water. And what a loss that was, this moment of bonding and connection that is based on being able to trust the water that runs through your taps and think of it as a thing that is healthy versus toxic. All of a sudden, the question of lead pipe replacement and all of the stats that I already knew about the number of lead service lines in the country and the decades that it had taken to replace them since they were banned in new construction really hit my heart in a very different way. And that feeling of caring because it connects to our lives is exactly the spark that we're trying for when we're talking about infrastructure. Infrastructure can be so, the language of infrastructure can be quite technical, especially for those of you that are working on project scoping, writing grant loan proposals, et cetera. And so what we're trying to do is bring it closer to home and heart. So I'd love to hear from you in the chat if there are particular infrastructure ideas, projects, concepts that you're struggling to communicate. We've heard quite a lot from partners working on state revolving funds that whole process with its alphabet soup is super challenging. And we've also heard quite a lot about green stormwater infrastructure and PFAS. But I'd love to hear if there are things that are top of mind or top priorities for your organization that have been tricky to communicate. Yeah, and please feel free to drop them in the chat. Water rates, yes, the whole question of affordability and the low-income household water affordability assistance program, yes, is pretty tricky. And actually, we have some polling on water affordability that we're going to share. Seeing PFAS as well. Keep dropping them in if you would, and we're gonna go forward. Next slide, please. So, as I said, I'm going to share polling in a moment, and I want to take a second to talk about how we use polling. My colleague Hunter Cutting often describes the utility of public opinion research as either a roadmap or a weather report. If you think of it as a roadmap, it means that you communicate to voters in a way that speaks to their current concerns and issues they already support action on, as though there were a fixed course to get to solution, to get to support. If you consider it a weather report, it is merely a marker in time, a temperature check of what voters currently understand, both about problems and solutions, that opens up an opportunity for education and movement. So we typically think of polling more like a weather report. It tells us where there are gaps in an understanding that communications can help to fill in. And I just want to quickly note that while we're talking about messaging here, there are a whole bunch of different inputs that go into formulation and shifts in public opinion, right? And media is a big one. Media is one of the sort of like stew of information sources that we all take in. And media changes too. And so one of the things that we are always thinking about when we're offering messaging advice is how can we also shift the stories that people are reading and hearing in newspapers, on radio, on TV, as well as on their smart devices through social media. Next slide. And worth noting that per Pew Research, Pew does annual research on where people rely on for news. TV, and specifically national network news and social media through smartphones are the primary places that people get information, news specifically. And that can be challenging because, you know, the typical Instagram story or post or YouTube video or TV segment, which is just a couple of seconds long, don't offer a lot of context. And that's where your work as advocates who are talking directly to communities as well as directly to decision makers and offering more context really add value. Next slide. As I said, public opinion is changeable. And so this is a look from Yale's program on climate change communication on how American concerns about global warming have shifted over time. This is looking at 13 years worth of change. And I want to call your attention particularly to the Navy ball. That is the number of people that are alarmed about global warming. And it went from being like at the 10th percentile to being at the very top, and around the 30th percentile. And you might guess why that is. It's amidst of people having experienced a lot more extreme weather, seeing a lot more impacts in their communities as well as elsewhere in the world. There's also been a shift in the way that we talk about global warming and the amount of stories about extreme weather events that connect the dots. And so that dot connecting is a really big part of what we try to do and what we're trying to support you in doing. Next slide. While public opinion shifts over time, there are core values that are like at the root of our belief systems, our value systems, the way we make sense of the world, that tend to stay the same. And this list comes from long time political strategists and pollsters, Belden and Rusinello. And they call these like the primary values that tend to hold true across different groups, whether political, ethnic, age, et cetera. It's about care for yourself and your family, personal liberty or self-determination, work, spirituality, and honesty, integrity, fairness, and equality. And so those are the sort of immovable, universal values that we want to try to tap into, but we recognize that the language that resonates with these values may look very different depending on the community that you're working in, and that's where your local expertise and relationships really help. Next slide. And as I was saying, there is a way in which we talk about infrastructure that can be quite sanitizing and technical. So for instance, talking about household income, residential or domestic wells, talking about, safety concerns in terms of exceedances or impairments or violation, and solutions in these super technical wonky terms like green stormwater infrastructure or low impact development. We actually have a whole list of words that we'll drop into the chat and include in our follow-up of like wonky words to avoid and simpler substitutions. And making sure that our language is as accessible as possible, but also as relatable as possible is definitely a core part of our practice. Next slide. So without further preamble, let's dig into the latest on what polling says voters care about on infrastructure. First, and really good news, again, this is from our August 2023 poll. When we asked voters what types of infrastructure they think should be a priority for investment by the federal government, drinking water and sewage won by a long shot, above renewable energy, well above roads, well above houses, well above things like airports that people typically think of as infrastructure. So even though drinking water infrastructure is largely invisible in many cases, we can't see water mains, we can't see laterals and lead service lines, they still are of very strong concern to voters because they understand the connection between safe drinking water, safe sanitation, and public health. Next slide. We asked another question about goals for local water spending. So recognizing that a lot of federal funds flow through state revolving funds to utilities and to municipalities as well as tribes. And we gave a number of goals. And when we asked about goals, drinking water safety topped the list, no surprise there. What did surprise us was that affordable water bills ranked as one of the top goals for voters. I was also a little bit surprised that clean water for fish and wildlife rose above the idea of clean water for swimming and boating. But I recently saw some other polling by Morning Consult. This was a confidential poll that was specifically about the Colorado River Basin. And it showed that voters are more supportive of conservation restoration projects for the river's benefit than for the benefit of water users, whether you're talking about irrigators or drinkers or manufacturing and other industries. And so, and that's just, the latest in polling I've seen that shows people really see intrinsic value in nature, not just as, natural services or ecosystem services, but they believe in saving places because the places are valuable in and of themselves. And so I think that's a great reminder to those of us who are working on conservation and restoration that voters already care. Next slide. And as I said, in addition to loving nature for its intrinsic value, there's also really strong support for nature-based solutions. We asked about solutions for communities experiencing pollution and flooding, and 82% of voters said they support investing in rain gardens and parks. And then we asked what terms resonate most to describe this solution set. Nature-based solutions polled far higher than, for instance, green infrastructure or natural infrastructure. I see a hand from Lita. Do you want to unmute and speak up? Lita, you should be unmuted if you want to share your question.
I didn't have a question. Sorry.
Oh, okay, very good. Okay, then carrying on. Next slide, please. We saw the same support for nature-based solutions when we asked about drought responses. And really heartening here that voters expressed or considered it more important to protect source waters. So for instance, restoring forests and floodplains and protecting stream corridors in natural areas than developing new water sources or water recycling and reuse. Interestingly, they were not as supportive of conservation and efficiency or reducing the amount of water used for irrigated agriculture. I'm not sure if that's because there's been so much conservation messaging for so long that people are under the impression we've sort of maxed out, or if it's because, you know, this restoration work doesn't require personal change. But interesting, given that we're in this moment when both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act have quite a lot of funding for watershed restoration, for ecosystem restoration, the voters are on board with that. Next slide. When we asked about flood solutions and gave a whole list of options, voters were more inclined to say that built flood controls like pumps and levees were very important than natural flood controls like wetlands and floodplains or green space like parks. But they were all more than 2/3 of voters deemed important. So I think, still strong support for green solutions. And then we had a whole series of questions, and we'll drop the link to the polls report as well as the top lines in the chat. And if you will also send it as a follow-up and to all folks who registered for this webinar. When we ask questions about equity, the first takeaway that was really heartening and consistent with past polling is that 89% of voters agree that access to safe and affordable water is a human right. And then we wanted to get at Justice 40 support. Looking at the executive order itself, as well as the materials coming out from the Biden administration and other groups working on Justice 40, we noticed there were a bunch of different terms that were used to describe the communities that are being prioritized. And so we asked voters if they support Justice 40 investments targeted to overburdened communities, disadvantaged communities, marginalized communities, or environmental justice communities. All of them polled really well. Overburdened or disadvantaged polled slightly better, although there was some variation by race. And so if you want to dig into the specifics of this, we're very happy to share the crosstabs as well. This is consistent with last year. We asked questions about prioritizing infrastructure spending in different communities. And what we found is that people were more supportive of prioritizing infrastructure investments in certain communities when you described the impacts they're experiencing. So whether that was risk of floods and fires and other climate disasters, or health problems like asthma and cancer and heart disease, those descriptors were more resonant than like these shortcut terms that we tend to use, like overburdened communities. So I think in general, when making the case for targeted investments, the more specific and descriptive you can be, the higher the support we'll see. Just backing up for a second, worth noting that there was stronger support for the term water just equity than water justice. Not sure why that was, and I was a little bit surprised by the strength of preference. So quick summary of polling, and then we'll delve into the messaging recommendations. Safe drinking water is a bipartisan political winner. Again, we have crosstabs where you can look at answers by political party as well as by race and ethnicity and some other demographics. Voters want to protect nature for nature's sake and see value in nature-based solutions. And then there's broad support for targeted or prioritizing spending in communities with the most need or those living with health and climate impacts. I'm going to pause there, Jessica, and ask if there are any questions in the chat that we ought to get to before we sort of pivot to messaging.
Sure. Kevin is asking if there was any partisan difference in the responses. I know that you'd mentioned that there's bipartisan support, but were there differences across party lines?
Absolutely, yes. And it varied by question how strong the difference was, right? We typically see more support for conservation spending and safety, health and safety regulations among Democrats and independents than Republicans. And that definitely held in this poll. Happy to share the crosstabs, Kevin, so you can look in specifically, but it's really heartening to see, for instance, on questions around PFAS regulation, that majorities across parties supported. And that's definitely true in terms of water being a priority for infrastructure investment. But there is nonetheless some partisan difference.
We also have a question from Amal. They're asking if we were able to track this state by state or regionally.
No, we did a sample of 2,000 voters, which isn't large enough to do a state by state analysis. The sample size is too small. I'll have to check if we have the ability or to do regional analysis.
Great. There are a couple questions about messaging around wonky topics, but we can get to that at the end, I think.
Sounds great. So as I said, in addition to doing public opinion research, the Water Hub also does some media analysis. We're working on a media audit now that will look at infrastructure stories over the past year. But I also have a bunch of Google alerts set up. And so this is just a snapshot of news about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act and water. And you'll notice that the story, by and large, is the money. And that partly has to do with where we are in the life cycle of these bills, right? We're still we're only into year 2 of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and we're like just finished the 1-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so right now money is going out, but projects haven't yet been built. But there's also this whole thing in which the Biden administration is touting their investing in America agenda, Bidenomics, where they're really leading with the dollars. And that can be problematic for a couple of reasons. One, there are questions about cost, inflation, the deficit, et cetera, their active efforts to reduce water and conservation funding and future spending packages because the historic sum that was included in these laws. And 2, because it doesn't resonate with the values that our polling shows people care most about, which is the benefit of investing in clean water. Next slide. So yeah, this is just an example of why that is the headlines, is because the Biden-Harris administration are leading with the dollars, as well as many of their agencies. Next slide. But what we think is more effective when we're talking about water is emphasizing the benefits rather than the cost. So talking about how investing in water makes our community safer, healthier, and more vibrant, and speaking about some of the waterways that we're trying to protect, flowing rivers, swimmable lakes, et cetera. So here's how we recommend doing that. This is the formula that we typically use when we are building a message. And we have a message development guide that Jessica will drop into the chat. It starts with values. So we want to begin by connecting with our audience on something they already care about, something aspirational, ideally like a positive value versus the thing we're fighting. And then we go into a problem or a threat to that thing we care about. And finally, there's the solution or call to action, sometimes both. So I'd love for folks to drop into the chat if there are specific local values that resonate in your community. I shared some of the universal ones like home, health, family, personal liberty or self-determination, spirituality, care for future generations, but would love to hear what resonates in your community. And then I'm going to share some cool examples of really values forward messaging campaigns from partners as we go along. Protecting lakes and streams in Minnesota. Thank you, Jana. Yeah, and as I'll get into, I think the more specific you can be. So obviously we know that Minnesota is the land of many lakes. The more that people can recognize their own place in your messaging, I think the more powerful it is. Next slide, please. So yeah, these are the sort of broad brush values. Next slide. And here's how we're seeing this done really well by some of our partners. So this is a stormwater campaign by the Water Collaborative of Greater New Orleans. And it's a little hard to see the banner behind them. The headline for the campaign, or the title of the campaign, is Democratize Drainage. And the tagline is, when we rise up, we keep the water down. And then to the side, it says water justice for New Orleans. So there's this whole, sense of community, of collective action that is addressing what is a long-standing, but even more currently urgent threat in New Orleans around flooding. Next slide. This was quite a similar campaign in Los Angeles. So both trying to raise local funds for green stormwater infrastructure in a way that's multi-benefit for communities. The Los Angeles version, which was a few years ago and was very much a collaborative effort, was called Our Water LA. And it talked a lot about a stronger water future for Los Angeles, but it also used the idea of, it also talked about unity, like different groups coming together. And so those values of democracy, of justice, of unity, of water strength or security can often be resonant, but also in a way that speaks really to like a local ethos. Next slide. And then this is an example from quite a different campaign across the country in the Delaware River Basin. This was an event a few years ago organized by the Upstream Alliance and the Littoral Society called Flowtopia. And it was called a rally for the river, a rally for a swimmable, accessible, fishable, and equitable Delaware River. And some of the materials that I saw about this float were about bringing people back to the river. I used to work on communications for the Delaware River Watershed Initiative in that region. And one of the things that local groups told me is that many communities in that area have sort of industrialized the rivers and turned their backs on them. And so this idea of calling people back to the river and celebrating the progress that's been made to make formerly industrialized and really contaminated waterways swimmable and floatable again, I think is really cool and also speaks to the local context. So pivoting now from value to problem, here we want to talk about local pain points. And I think the more recent, the better. And unfortunately, there are a lot of water challenges that are facing communities. So whether that's, water main breaks, whether that's boil water notices, sewage backups, flooded streets and basements, I think the more specific we can be, the better. Next slide. So some examples, this is from Bayou City Waterkeeper, which has a long-standing and well-publicized issue with sewer overflows. And in their work on accountability, Bayou City Waterkeeper publishes this pretty cheeky monthly poo report under the hashtag Poo Free Bayou City. And again, it's speaking about an issue of combined sewer overflows in a way that is, totally accessible and speaks to the way people experience them. And they have a whole map showing where they're happening most frequently and some of the equity dimensions of that. So again, making the problem really concrete for people versus talking about, questions of pipes being over capacity and the need to separate stormwater and sewage infrastructure. Next slide. This is a recent op-ed from Richard Diaz of Blue Green Alliance and the Coalition on Lead Emergency and Joe Fitzgerald of Milwaukee Water Commons that I thought was really powerful. It ran in September at a time that's back to school for many communities, right? And they were talking about how they led the op-ed with, kids are returning to school now, eager to learn, but some will struggle more than others due to high rates of lead poisoning. So speaking to a specific moment in families' lives, back to school, and then connecting the dots to lead and learning challenges, lower IQs, all of the sort of lifelong impacts that we know lead poisoning can have. And I see a note from Kate about a challenge with Flowtopia and not encouraging safe river use or personal flotation devices. So thank you very much for flagging that, Kate. Solutions. How can we multi-solve local challenges? So some of the ways that we've been thinking about describing the direction we want to head with bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act spending, and this is what we heard from many groups working on the ground, is an emphasis on justice or equity, an emphasis on pairing the latest and greatest technology and engineering with working with nature. And then again, that piece about prioritizing areas with the most need. And I should say there's another really critical piece here that I neglected to add to this slide about community engagement. And we've seen lots of really good materials and work by grassroots groups trying to connect residents to the state revolving fund process, to utilities, green infrastructure planning, to all the sort of infrastructure work that has historically not been inclusive of local needs. or reflective of local needs. So a couple of examples of that, of solution stories that really speak to values. So this was a story about Klamath Dam removal, and it talks about first foods and then goes on to talk quite a lot about food sovereignty in a way that is like honoring the relationship that local tribes, the Karuk and Klamath and Yurok people, have to salmon and to the river itself. Next slide. And then here, another river restoration story, but a very different vibe. This is a new story about a restoration effort by Trout Unlimited to restore the Price River by removing a dam. And in this case, it's a historic mining town that is in a bit of economic transition. And the real lead is about revitalizing the town and how the free-flowing river is luring locals, tourists, tubers, and more. Next slide. And then this is from the Nature Conservancy, who is also working on restoration of the Price River, and their angle on it is about solving problems for farmers and fish. It's really honoring the stewardship and the connection to place that local farmers have, and talking about how restoring the river can provide more security and more reliable water, both for irrigators as well as for the many fish that live there. One more piece that I want to get to before we open it up for question and answer. Given that people are primarily relying on TVs, social media, and smartphones for information, messaging and communications isn't just words, right? I just spent a whole bunch of time talking about the words that we recommend and feel are resonant, but imagery is so powerful, especially in a world where people are consuming a lot of news on a small screen, where maybe they're scrolling so fast that they're not even reading the captions and they're literally just scanning images to decide whether or not they should stop. And infrastructure can be hard to communicate graphically, visually, right? There are some great visuals of lead pipe replacement happening, of, willows being planted to stabilize stream banks, et cetera. But for projects that haven't yet started construction, it can be difficult. And so a couple of pieces of advice. One, for those of you who are restoration or conservation practitioners, really recommend taking before and after and in progress photos. Those can be drone, they can be smartphone, they don't have to be super high quality, but I think being able to show transformation is super powerful. And then the second thing is, when you're talking about green infrastructure, my former colleagues at Resource Media did a pretty cool image testing exercise with Washington Environmental Council, in which they tested a whole bunch of different images of green stormwater infrastructure installations throughout Seattle to see which ones generated the most engagement. And they found that, and their hypothesis was that, like, mature plantings, if you showed a really beautiful bioswale with, flowering plants, that was going to be the most engaging. But what they found is actually when green infrastructure is shown as an amenity with people gathering there, kids sitting with bikes in a park, someone, riding their bike or walking along a green street or green alley. When people are in the picture and you can see that the green stormwater infrastructure has actually enhanced livability and community, those were the things that resonated most. And so I think, most of our partners are fantastic about putting people in the picture, but just wanted to share that, and we'll include the link to their message testing and write-up in the follow-up email. They also have a pretty cool free open source green infrastructure image bank. It's very Pacific Northwest. I used a number of their images in this slide deck. So for those of you working in other parts of the country, probably not relevant. But it's a good example of what works because they've done a fair amount of visual testing. So quickly want to summarize, because I covered quite a lot, and then open it up for questions and sharing. I'd love to hear what's working for you. So in summary, our messaging should paint a picture of the future we want. So, an affirmative vision of thriving communities, clean flowing rivers, abundant wildlife, places for people to gather, as I said. It should speak to lived experiences in your community, so being very local. It should explain how historic funding puts solutions in reach. So, we don't have to use the terms bipartisan infrastructure law or Inflation Reduction Act necessarily, but communicating the role of the federal government investing in water, I think, is important as we're trying to make the case for future investments and defend against, cuts. And then just acknowledging that, so many of our partners work intersectionally, and that infrastructure is not just a question of water safety, of flood preparedness or drought preparedness, but it's also a question of housing, of walkable, safe streets, of health, of clean air, of cooling urban heat islands. And so just acknowledging those intersections and speaking about infrastructure holistically. Even though we work on water, we recognize that it's something that touches so many other concerns in people's lives. And then, sort of these big picture examples of leading with the payoff, not the process, using really simple language that's descriptive, that paints a picture. And then celebrating local leadership, because there is so much incredible work happening in so many communities. And Amy, yeah, we'll include a link to that image bank in our follow-up email, or I can just drop you an email. Amy had asked if we have a link to the Resource Media Green Infrastructure Image Bank. And last slide, that is really it. Would love to hear questions, reflections, and or what's working for you.
I'm going to drop some links while y'all are pondering what you want to ask and share. So bear with me and keep an eye on the chat.
Will do.
First question, sorry, I can kick it off, is how April's asking how voters relate to the word infrastructure.
April, this is something that came up when we were actually writing up the polling report, and we were saying we should have asked that question. I can do a little look. I did a quick search back in August when we were processing the first the polling results, and I don't think I found any focus groups specifically asking that. But it's a great question because we've all been leading with it, right? And trying to make sure that people understand that water is part of it, and also that nature is infrastructure too. And it's a great question of whether the idea of infrastructure really communicates what we hope it does, which is like a foundation for healthy lives, for livable communities, et cetera. I don't know the answer to that, but it's a great question. And we're just starting to put together like some notes for our next national poll, so we can definitely make a note of that.
Awesome. Oakley is asking, how does the public respond to the idea that water infrastructure is creating jobs, especially in rural areas and other high unemployment areas?
So Oakley, we didn't poll job creation as like as a message this time around. We have in past years, both in the West and nationally, and we found that neither the idea of cost savings nor job creation were primary motivators for people to support infrastructure investments or green infrastructure. So I think in general, while those can be helpful secondary talking points, especially as you said, there are some areas that are really high unemployment for which this is going to be a huge boon. I think we would defer to your sense of like what's top of mind for residents, but speaking nationwide for voters, that historically hasn't risen to the top in terms of motivations for investing in infrastructure.
Great. Do we want to go back to some of the thoughts around message, like talking about some of these wonkier topics? Like Candace asked how to communicate about increasing floodplain biodiversity safely without increasing flood risk, and how to message around that.
That is a tricky one. Biodiversity is another term I think that we've never tested the idea of, or voters' understanding of biodiversity. And I think the sort of like question that you're asking is pretty nuanced in terms of, managing some goals that can sometimes be at odds. I think that what we've seen in general, given that voters recognize like, you know, the intrinsic value in nature, in healthy nature, and habitat for fish and wildlife, I think you can probably speak to making this place more livable or hospitable, making a home for fish and wildlife, and then acknowledge the flooding concerns. But again, that's a little more of a nuanced issue. So if you want to strategize about it with a little bit more context, we'd be happy to do that. Yeah, and I should say before we delve into the next question, so the reason that we're offering this webinar is that the Water Hub does have some dedicated funding to work on infrastructure communications. The message guide that we're going to share as a follow-up to this webinar is just the first of a series of resources we're going to be launching over the next couple of months on, you know, how to talk about safe water and sanitation, how to talk about flood justice, how to talk about drought preparedness and living with weather whiplash. And so we're trying to produce resources that are responsive to what we've heard folks are needing help with. But if you have a specific issue that you'd like to thought partner on, we are also open to that.
Great. Julie was asking about how to talk about rainfall infrastructure.
Rainfall infrastructure, as in like green infrastructure to catch rain or cisterns. I'm not quite sure if I know what she means.
Yeah. Is Julie Sager still here and wants to clarify? So Kevin is also, Kevin, who works with Julie, says, yes, green infrastructure to catch the rain.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I mean, I think that what we found from image testing is that people often value green infrastructure. We've seen this from polling as well, for values that it provides communities other than infiltration. So often people value, for instance, bioswales for, you know, slowing down traffic on a bikeway, or adding shade and greenery to a street, rather than because they're reducing flooding concerns or reducing stormwater pollution. So I think knowing the local context and knowing what the neighborhoods in which you're going to be installing green stormwater infrastructure and the specifics will help. But I think often that the idea of green infrastructure as an amenity. So there are some really cool green alleys that have been built, for instance, in Los Angeles, that are about making more walkable communities in places that don't have a lot of sidewalks. And there are like there's play equipment, and there are trees, and there's murals on the ground. And so those pieces that make it attractive and that make it a place for people to gather often are valued even more than the ecosystem services that green infrastructure makes. But the why or what specifics are often super local. But in general, rather than talking about infiltration or, you know, stormwater capture or groundwater recharge, if we want to talk about that specific function, we might use language like soak up and sink, or slow down rain when it's running off of roads and roofs. So using really simple descriptive terms about what those installations do. And there are some descriptions in the words to use and avoid spreadsheet that Jessica dropped into the chat. And then we did another training recently on water words where I think we got into a little bit more green infrastructure messaging.
Nice. I just want to go back to, since it's in the news quite a bit, PFAS. Annabelle Gregg had asked how to talk about PFAS.
Yes. Well, we actually pulled PFAS. I didn't include it here because it was, you know, although of course the bipartisan infrastructure law includes funding for PFAS testing and treatment and other emerging contaminants, it just felt like we had a lot to cover. But we tested a specific description for PFAS, which we'll include in the follow-up. And basically, and I think we actually tested two different descriptions. We tested, are people more concerned about the health impacts or about their persistence? And we found that it didn't really matter, that people are concerned about PFAS forever chemicals, regardless of what problem you zoom into. And so I think it can vary depending on your audience. But when we've been speaking about PFAS, we try to start with where they found. So describing, for instance, they're in nonstick cookware, they're in waterproof clothing, they are in, fire extinguishing materials, and then describing all the places they've been found from, the bodies of fish and wildlife, breast milk, blood, etc. And then the difficulty of cleaning them up because they last so long and the bonds of these chemicals are so hard to break. So really trying to break down the idea of PFAS by locating them in people's lives and explaining why this particular family of chemicals is really hard to clean up and hard to get out of water.
Jesse Snyder had asked how to talk about transitioning off of the mindset of can't drink our water to one post-project after things have changed.
Yeah, there have been some really cool tap water campaigns. I know Philadelphia did one, and I'm trying to think of others, but we know that trust in tap water has been eroding across the country for years. The U.S. Water Alliance actually does a really cool annual survey called the Value of Water, where they look at trust in tap water as well as confidence in local water infrastructure. And I'll say it does vary by community. White and wealthy communities tend to have higher levels of trust, justifiably, because they tend to have lower levels of violations. But I think in the wake of a project, there is a level of rebuilding trust that needs to be done by both the utility and, in many cases, local groups that have stronger ties to communities. And so if you want to contact us to, for examples or to strategize, we're definitely happy to talk about it, but acknowledge that that's like a big problem and a sort of an issue that we need to tackle, because the first need, right, is communicating when there's a problem. And we know, we've also heard that that's a challenge, is that in many cases when water isn't safe to drink, maybe that's not being communicated adequately in all the languages that residents speak in a way that's accessible to everyone. So, there's first notifying people that there's a safety concern and make sure they're not exposed to contaminated water. And then there's communicating when the issue has been resolved and rebuilding trust.
Brianna is asking if we can speak to what metrics for success have looked like for different water campaigns, and that they are working on a public awareness campaign for water in Texas and are struggling to identify behavior changes that they can measure and tie to the campaign.
I think it's really, I'll say the Water Hub tends to work on policy change campaigns. And so, it's pretty easy to declare success or not based on whether or not you manage to get legislation through and adopted and then implemented in a way that's just. But in terms of behavior change, I think, we would recommend starting with the goal. So depending on whether your public awareness campaign is about conservation or is about, trust in tap water or something else, lawn replacement, installation of, cisterns and other infrastructure, I think that'll inform the goal. And I think it's helpful to be focused, particularly in Texas, where there are all of these overlapping challenges. I think it can be quite overwhelming for voters or for residents. And so focusing in on a specific action as opposed to people feeling like they have to do a dozen different things, I think can be helpful. So speaking specifically about conservation, for instance, I've seen really successful campaigns that were focused on a single intervention, whether that's about lawn replacement in Las Vegas or, installing more high efficiency washing machines in the Bay Area, rather than like umbrella conservation campaigns that I think often end up with fatigue and people feeling like we're asking for really draconian measures.
Nice. I'm also just going to tack on that. Prior to working here at the Water Hub, I worked at a regional nonprofit called Tree People here in the LA area. We worked on our Water LA campaign, but our research director and policy director relied on a method called community-based social marketing. And it was all around gauging and encouraging behavior change and tracking it. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to learn more about it, but they were pretty dedicated to it. And like you said, measuring lawn replacement or, gauging what it was. Sometimes they would even distribute signs for people to put in their yards to see, like, are people sending out the signal? You just need to figure out what it is you're hoping people to see and change. So I'm going to drop the link.
Thank you, Jessica.
Any other questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat. And another shameless plug to please take the survey that I dropped in the chat, and that I'll drop again so that you can have it handy, because we do want to hear from you and offer your honest feedback on how we can improve our trainings or other things you would like to learn more about, be it messaging, PR, digital, the works. But I'm dropping it right now again and encourage people to ask more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And just as a reminder, we will be sending a follow-up probably Monday, because I have a deadline tomorrow, that will include this poll, our last poll, some of our other resources around messaging water and water words and sound bites that are really effective, and that message development template. And then if you have specific infrastructure needs that you'd like to workshop, you should feel free to respond and ask for a one-on-one call. And then more specific message guides are to come on some of the issues I mentioned, like flood justice, like drought preparedness, like safe water and sanitation. So stay tuned for those. And please, if you haven't already, sign up for our newsletter, because that is the list to which we will be sending all of our forthcoming infrastructure resources. And if we have no more questions, I think we can give folks a passing period before their next meeting. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We'll also include the slides and the recording in the follow-up email in case you want to share anything with colleagues. Thank you very much.